right, today we are taking a look at the FuelCell SuperComp Trainer from New Balance. Before we get into today's video, please don't forget to like, share, subscribe, all those things. Click that little notification bell so you find out when the latest Gearist news, reviews, all those sorts of things come published. Now, let's get into this review. Now, before this shoe even slides on your foot, it is illegal. Now, what does that mean, right? So World Athletics is an organization that sets the standards for what is an acceptable kind of metric of gear, whether that's like a pole vault pole or in this case, running shoes, right? So for a track running shoe, the most stack that you can have is 20 millimeters of stack height. For a road running shoe, it's 40 millimeters of stack height. And by the way, if you want to see links for this, you can check it out down in the description below. But for this guy right here, this shoe, this FuelCell SuperComp Trainer or the SC Trainer, this comes in at 47 millimeters of stack height. Now, what does that mean to you? If you're not really going to be competitive in a race, it probably doesn't mean anything. But if you're somebody like, I don't know, Eliud Kipchoge or somebody like that, he's not going to be wearing a shoe like this because there's just straight up too much stack. Fortunately for me, my speed doesn't exactly put me at the tip of the spear of most races that I'm going to enter, so it's really kind of a moot point. With all that, this is still a really amazing shoe with some very, very cool technology. From the FuelCell Foam that is kind of put in two parts here, to that Energy Arc carbon fiber plate that is embedded in the midsole there. This is a shoe that's not just going to be your daily trainer, although it is a daily trainer. This is going to be a shoe that's going to make you want to go further and faster. So let's get into talking about it. First up is the outsole of this shoe, which you can see here. The first thing that you can really kind of notice about this is this big, huge channel right there that runs kind of down the middle of the midsole into the outsole, or outsole into the midsole. Now we're going to talk about that a little bit more in the midsole section, but before we get to all that, let's look at the outsole material. Up here in the forefoot, you kind of have these separate wings, and they're, again, back here in the rear foot. Up in the forefoot, you have a more durable rubber. I'm not exactly sure of what the compound is, but even just pressing on it, you can tell that the forefoot rubber, which is where the majority of that traction or kind of abrasion is going to take place, is a little more stiff than the rear. Both of these very flexible around the shoe. You can also see that back here, you've got kind of a cutaway. This is this light blue, or this light gray rather, green gray, whatever color that is, in the middle of the blue. And then up here in the forefoot, it's a little more difficult to see, but there are cutaways, and this is going to help to shave some weight, which we're going to touch on a little bit later when we kind of get into the meat and potatoes of the shoe. From a durability standpoint, I've got about 55 to 65, give or take, I'd have to look, miles on this shoe. It's done very, very well, actually. You can see where it's kind of dirty in those spots where I'm hitting the majority of that abrasion, but it's held up very well and exactly where I would want it to see for a daily driver like this. Taking on corners, turns, things like that, it's actually pretty grippy, and we will touch on the kind of the stability of the shoe a little bit later because that's certainly something that people are going to wonder about. Interestingly, for such a kind of tech-heavy shoe in the midsole, the outsole is very, very simple. There's just not a lot going on there, which I guess is part of what you kind of want to see in a really fast road shoe. So let's get now into the midsole of this guy. All 47 millimeters of it in the heel here. It's also worth mentioning that in the forefoot here, you've got 39 millimeters of stack, giving it an overall drop of 8 millimeters. And since there are kind of parts that I think really need to be broken down separately in the midsole of this shoe, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about each of the sections kind of individually from the bottom up. So first, this bottom. So you see kind of this blue line here. So our first piece of, we're going to kind of use that as our barometer. That's where our first piece of foam, a FuelCell foam, is below that, right? So you can see it, kind of how deep it is based on that channel. I mean, it's probably double or almost triple my finger height down in there. I mean, it's quite a deep channel, and so you can actually see where that midsole material spills over into this void through here. As we move forward, it obviously, because it's kind of a modern day running shoe and there's a bit of a wedge action there, it actually slopes down toward this blue part. This light blue part actually sits on top of the carbon fiber plate, the Energy Arc section of this shoe. And that, I would assume, is because if you're putting enough weight or torque into the midsole of the shoe, you're going to press that down into the ground, and they really don't want to scuff up that carbon plate and risk cracking it. Now the Energy Arc, that is our carbon fiber plate as we move up to the next level. That's this guy right here. Now here is an exploded version of this shoe that you guys can see. This is being able to kind of take it and look at it and profile it exactly what it looks like, because it's not just a carbon fiber like flat plate. It both arches this way, kind of side to side, and then it obviously is kind of shaped a little bit like a spoon sort of shape as it goes toward the forefoot. What this is meant to do is for when your weight is applied to it, it flattens out that carbon plate side to side, and then it kind of propels you kind of up and forward, right? That is in addition to the spoon shape moving forward in the foot that I mentioned a second ago. This second piece of foam is what sits on top as we look in profile on top of that blue line there. And this is going to be that more traditional kind of, it's still a pretty simple section of foam of the same fuel cell foam, but what it's doing is protecting your foot, or I guess protecting the carbon plate from your foot, depending on which way you look at it. What it's doing is creating a barrier between the energy arc carbon plate and the bottom of your foot. That is primarily going to add kind of that cushion and that comfort factor so that there's not just a rigid plate right under the bottom of your foot. So the first thing that a lot of people that see this shoe and they look at how much stack there is, they're gonna go, oh my God, I'm going to roll an ankle. And quite frankly, years ago when I first saw maximalist shoes or more high stack shoes, I thought the same thing. In those shoes and in this shoe right here, that's not really a problem. The first thing is we can look kind of from the back and from the front is that the midsole and outsole itself are wider than where your foot sits. It's kind of almost like a pyramid structure, right? Pyramids are very stable. They're not going tipping over anytime soon. And this is kind of a similar thing, right? They're wider at the bottom than they are on top. It creates stability. That said, this foam is pretty cushy, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in the ride section, because I went and I looked at the New Balance website, and there are some reviews by people, granted, the very, 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 very small minority, saying, hey, I went around a turn, I rolled an ankle in this. And of course, they blame the shoe. I don't know that is, I wouldn't agree that that's necessarily at fault. I think it's kind of a combination of things, right? It is a high stack shoe, and if you're really not paying attention to that sort of thing, once you start to go, you're kind of just gonna go. But I felt this to be rather stable. Now about this channel in the middle of the shoe here. Okay, so here's how this works. As you compress the foam on either side of this, right, as the weight comes down, if we're looking at it like this, I guess, as weight comes down on the shoe, this foam has to go somewhere. It has to expand. So on a single piece foam shoe, right, so you've got a big single piece of foam underfoot, it's going to go kind of like this and kind of bathtub out, and it's not going to propel anywhere but from the sides and up and inward into your heel, for instance, or your midfoot or what have you. In this case, what's happening is that foam is compressing kind of two sides. I'm trying to hold this and show you. Both sides are compressing out and in, and then when they kind of go back, when that energy is returned back into your foot, both sides of foam are coming up. So it's actually a much springier action in that area. And it actually does come all the way up right under the metatarsal heads there. This channel comes all the way up under the forefoot, which is very nice. So that, in addition to the plate, creates a lot of responsiveness under there. If that channel weren't there, the foam would have nowhere to go. And frankly, you would feel even probably more instability because it just wouldn't have anywhere to go. In this case, it creates additional springiness that I like. Now let's talk about that energy arc plate. This guy right here, I love it. I love it. Honestly, when you're standing around in the shoe, and I'll touch on this more in the ride section, when you're just standing around in the shoe, you're like, okay, it's kind of squishy and soft, and I feel like it's doing something because there is rather aggressive rocker shape, as you can see, kind of toward the forefoot there. But frankly, once you get going, and again, I'll touch on it more in the ride, this sucker pops. Like, you can see the amount of rigidity and pop that comes out of this, and it's really, really great as it pertains to the ride. So now let's get into the upper of this shoe, of the SC Trainer from New Balance. So here's what's really great about this. First, it's made of primarily just a single piece of no-sew foam. So there's one stitch right back here along the heel counter, the kind of foxing back here, and it's just one piece. Now, what I really like about that is there's a little bit of stretch, but I'm going to talk about that more in a second. As we look internal, there is kind of a cuff, right? So it's difficult to see on here, but basically it's right around the midfoot, right around there. It doesn't extend all the way up through the vamp into the toe. There's a little bit of an internal structure, kind of a toe cap. It's not there for protection. It's mostly there just to keep the shape of the shoe in that area. Any overlays, right? Any support structure that's happening by way of overlays and things like that that are welded onto the shoe are primarily, and in fact, kind of only, right behind the end, the New Balance logo right here. You can feel on the inside, there's kind of a weld through of that. This is where that structure is going to be applied, which is good because if you're going around a corner or something like that and you're kind of torquing out on the shoe, I said torquing, not twerking, get your mind out of the gutter. That's where you're going to apply pressure to the shoe, not really on the medial side there. Despite this being touted as having a no-sew upper, it's not entirely a no-sew upper, apart from this stitch back here. Right here, you can see kind of this heel cup area, which I'll talk about in a second. This is where that internal cuff attaches, right? So there is a bit of sewing right there. It's very soft. I did not notice any hot spots. I took a run. I took 2 runs in this and then walked around some with no socks on, which I don't tend to do, but just really wanted to test that, and it came out very well. This blue section back here, this is the kind of internal padding. It's a very lightly padded heel cup, or heel counter, I guess in this case, but it's kind of rigid, and I'm going to talk about that more in a second, but we're just looking at the structure right now. There's a little bit of a heel tab pull that's not really a loop, and then right around the cuff, just barely around the cuff, like this last, what, half an inch, give or take, it's actually kind of a stretch knit, right? That meaning to kind of hug the ankle in that area. Now that mesh I mentioned a second ago, nice stretch right there. Look at that. It's not overly stretchy, and this is a good thing. There are some times, and there's a shoe, oh gosh, I can't remember what it is right now, but it had too much stretch, and I wanted to like it a lot because it was super comfortable to walk around in, super comfortable just to wear, and even on some slower runs, it was great. But when you wanted any sort of speed to it, it was almost like it was too much stretch, and your foot would kind of just be loosey-goosey on the inside. This is a tight stretch, right? So yes, you can stretch, you can actually see my fingers right there, but it's tight enough, especially as you kind of come around to the sides and the mesh tightens up, the holes aren't as big, that it's really going to hold your foot in place nicely, and I liked that a lot. This also has a great lock-in feel. I mean, you can see how kind of the throat of the lacing right there goes down toward the first metatarsal of the big toe, right? So it's the great toe, I guess. It's heading in that direction. It keeps it very open across the cuneiform, those bones across the top of your foot as it goes down to the metatarsal, kind of the base of the first metatarsal there. Very customizable. That cuff around the middle on the inside that I mentioned a second ago has a nice kind of soft feel to it and keeps you extra protected and braced in that area. From a durability perspective, this is exactly where it was pretty much the day I got it. I mean, I'm not really taking this off-road. I will say though that this is a very bright color. It's sort of a day glow green thing. If you're running in this and you're running in a lot of dirt, I would expect to get it dirty, but I mean, it's a running shoe. What do you expect? Finally, about this upper is the amount of breathability. It's very, very breathable. I had this in runs approaching 100 degrees many times. Very comfortable. I don't particularly get hot feet, but I can tell you that I can tell when there's no circulation of air going on in there. And this does a good job of overcoming that without letting in additional debris. All right, so now let's talk about the fit of this guy. The first thing that I will say is sizing. So I wear a men's size 11, and this is dead on true to size. I didn't have any issues with it. I don't necessarily think that you need to go up or down. It was right where an 11 should be. So if you've been in a particular size in New Balance, you're probably good to stay there. That said, this also comes in a wide version. A lot of the time you get into kind of these more technically advanced shoes, if you will, and you're gonna not have that wide version. This comes in a 2E, and while we did not check it out there, I have seen other people talking about how they really appreciated the fact that this is a wide shoe that can be a wide shoe rather, that performs just as well as the OG. We'll move kind of from the front of the shoe to the back of the shoe in terms of fit. The front, I like it. That internal toe cap that I mentioned a second ago, it gives a good shape internally, so I have plenty of room for my feet to feel like they're not being squished down from the top. And then additionally to that, there's a good amount of room in there. Yeah, it does come to a bit of a point, but it's not bad. It could be a little more on the lateral toe, but I mean, find a review where I haven't said that in recent memory. And again, this is an area where that stretch in the upper comes in very, very handy, especially for that toe splay and grip. As I mentioned already, that midfoot, that cuff that's internal there, that really gives a nice custom fit, right? You can mess around with these laces plenty. There's also an additional lace hole up here that I don't really use that gives a nice fit to the foot, and you can get it cinched down exactly how you want it. I feel the lacing is very good. It's actually pretty straightforward, and there's not a whole lot to talk about in that area. So the heel of this shoe, let's look at the heel cup. The first thing that I'll say is it's well shaped, right? So the amount of material in the inside of that heel cup, which is pretty rigid all the way up to kind of right there, almost up to the top of the tongue. It's not rigid, but it's more rigid than I think it probably needs to be. Now internally, this blue part, which has a little bit of that lightweight kind of ankle padding in that area, very comfortable. The heel tab of the Achilles insert doesn't bother me, but this heel cup, again, it feels like it should be a little more malleable than it is. When standing in place, it felt just fine. But as I started to run, and particularly as I started to kind of put on speed, which for me is very relative, but as I started to pick up, I feel like the heel counter and the kind of the heel cup of this just, it doesn't run. It's kind of incongruous with the custom fit and feel that you can achieve in the front, let's say 3/4 of the shoe. This just kind of stays stiff, and I was able to cinch it down, and I'm not saying that it was uncomfortable. Please don't get me wrong there. I still really enjoyed running in the shoe, as I'll talk about in a minute in the ride section, but I felt like it was just kind of a tale of two cities there. The forefoot and the front 3/4 of the shoe are one thing. It's great. You can cinch them down, nice amount of stretch here, and then you get to the back, and it's just kind of this cup that's there. So if your ankle or heel rather doesn't fit into it, I mean, you're going to have to hammer it down pretty hard to get there. Now, to overcome that, maybe they get rid of some of the rigidity in here, at least just to the very back, like back half an inch of that heel cup, which I would understand. That way you would have the ability of that material to stretch around the foot a little bit more in that area. Now we're going to talk about the ride of this guy. This is probably my favorite part. It's one of those things where you get standing in it, and you're like, oh, okay, interesting. And then you start to run, and it's a different world. Now, for me, that rocker shape, that tip forward, in addition to the foam, in addition to the energy arc plate, makes you freaking want to run. But before we talk about that, let me talk about those stability issues that some people on the New Balance website seem to have mentioned, right? And I mentioned it earlier. Yeah, there's a lot of stack with this. When you put the shoe on, that tip forward, kind of that aggressive rocker shape, it's going to make you feel like, whoa. But when you take a step back, no pun intended, and you really look at what's going on there, it's not intimidating. It really isn't. It behaves just as a running shoe should. It's just got more technological features that are going to propel you forward. And when the running starts in this, that's where I was like, oh my God, okay, so this is something different. Again, this is a training shoe, right? It's not your racing shoe. And I have to say that when I started running, I took it slow because I wanted to, and I would recommend that people that are a little bit concerned about stability try this as well. When you're going around corners and things like that, anything that's going to require any sort of agility in your running, especially on something that you're concerned about stability, take it slow. So I took it slow, kind of some cruiser stuff, and then it was just kind of like I just wanted to go. Especially the more I kind of sank down and bent my knees and hips and ankles and got into that kind of more athletic posture, and the more I took off and allowed myself to lean forward from the ankles, the shoe just really wants to run. Now I'll touch on that void again. Here's something interesting. I feel like if you land way on the lateral side of your foot, what could happen is that this foam could kind of push inward and then cause just kind of more instability on the outside if you are a heavy side lander, which you're probably overstriding if you're doing that as well. For me, I land pretty cleanly. So when my foot comes down, it comes down kind of like that. It barely touches the lateral side, and then it settles down flat. I noticed zero stability issues with this. And in fact, that void in the middle there, you can really kind of feel that action. You don't feel yourself sinking into it because that carbon plate, the energy arc, is really protecting you from that, right? It creates a bridge between those two sides. I didn't notice any hot spots either on the upper or on the footbed, which is just a pretty straightforward, simple sock liner you can see here. Really good stuff. Here's the thing about this. And this, I feel like, is one of those things that's it's kind of subjective because people have a different tolerance about weight on a shoe. This comes in at 345 grams and my men's size 11. That translates to 12.1 ounces. This is not light. It's not heavy. I mean, I've certainly run in much heavier shoes, but it's not light. Again, it's a daily trainer, so it's not your lightweight racer. And a lot of people might actually want that kind of a little bit more weight in their daily trainer so that when they take it off on race day, it's like, oh, look at this, I'm all of a sudden lighter. It could be lighter. I feel like some people that are going to be a little more picky about how much weight they have, especially in a daily trainer, are going to go, oh, 12 ounces. And now granted, that's my size, but it's very relative to the weight in your size shoe. I wish they would shave some weight off that. I don't know where to tell them to do it. This void certainly helps. The cutouts in the rear foot and the forefoot certainly help. Maybe a little bit in that heel counter might carve off like a half an ounce or quarter ounce or something like that. But it's a tricky balancing act. With all that, what I noticed about this from a ride perspective is that my legs felt fresh. I was able to run longer and faster, and quite frankly, one of the things that I like about this is that when I started running it, I felt more fit. Now, that's always a good thing. Like getting your fitness up there is a very good thing, especially in my case. But I really felt like it made me exceed where I was comfortable going on a normal run, right? A normal cruiser trainer run. And it made it very fun. And there are definitely shoes like that, shoes that we've taken a look like that recently. For me, they tend to be on trail, but on a road, this did a great job of really just pushing me forward, making me want to go. Now, at $179, this is not the cheapest thing in the world. I readily admit that. I will also say, though, that for the tech that you get on here and kind of that speed, that fitness increase aspect, I gotta be honest, the bang for your buck is very, very high, right? The value of this is very high. Yeah. $179 is not cheap. It's a very valuable shoe in what it makes you feel like doing, how much it makes you want to run, how fast it makes you want to run, and how you're just comfortable the whole time. I'm very curious to see where this shoe evolves. Is it going to go toward more of its cousins on the racing side, right? So the SuperComp shoes on the racing side. I'm very curious about that because I think this is a great tech shoe that's going to be a more seamless bridge from point A to point B being those racing flats. So I guess we'll see, fingers crossed, right? So hey, have you guys running this? I wanna hear. I mean, what do you think of this? Do you like running in high stack, cushy shoes? And let's make no mistake, this is a cushy shoe, right? It's still got all that pop, but it's nice and cushioned too. So what do you like to run in? Is this one of those things that you are eager to try, or have you already tried it? Let us hear down in the comments below. As I mentioned at the outset, guys, if you have not liked, share, subscribe, click the notification bell, send us an email, follow us on Instagram, all that stuff, we would really, really appreciate it. Thank you guys so much for joining us today. Get out there, have fun, and we'll talk to you next time.